Ladies and gentlemen, imagine this. The most powerful man in the world, convinced he can bend nations to his will, walks into the game expecting applause, obedience, and easy victory. And then, with one word, just one word, India's foreign minister rewrites the script, wipes the smug grin off Washington's playbook, and reminds the world that New Delhi is nobody's pawn. That word was reciprocity, and it was a thunderclap heard across the globe. When Jaishankar stood his ground with the word reciprocity, it wasn't just a throwaway line in diplomatic jargon, it was a masterstroke that instantly flipped the script in India's negotiations with the Trump administration. In diplomatic circles, words carry weight far heavier than they appear on the surface, and reciprocity has always been one of those loaded terms. It means quite simply, whatever treatment you extend to us, expect the same treatment in return. No free passes, no asymmetry, no lopsided deals dressed up as favors. At a time when Washington was pushing aggressively for concessions from India, expecting New Delhi to bend over backward in trade disputes and market access issues, this word was like drawing a line in the sand. India, through Jaishankar, declared that it would not play the role of a supplicant anymore. It was a reminder to the United States that the era when Washington dictated the terms was over and that the relationship had to be one of equals. Trump's administration believed in strong-arm tactics, tariffs, threats of withdrawal of benefits, blunt demands couched in the language of transactionalism. Many nations caved out of fear of losing US markets or falling out of Washington's strategic graces. But when Jaishankar used reciprocity, he turned the American tactic on its head. If the US imposed tariffs, India would match them. If Washington restricted visas or closed doors to Indian companies, India would respond in kind. The word carried with it the sharp edge of consequence. You cannot expect us to absorb blows without returning them. Suddenly, the balance of leverage shifted. America's expectation that India would quietly accept restrictions while continuing to offer access to its vast market looked naive, because Jaishankar showed that India had both the will and the capacity to respond in equal measure. The brilliance of the word lies not just in the act of standing firm, but in the subtlety of tone. Reciprocity isn't confrontational on the surface. It doesn't shout defiance, but it coolly asserts parity. It places the burden back on the other side. Treat us fairly if you want fairness in return. In the Trump era, where hyperbolic threats and brash negotiations were the norm, Jaishankar's calm invocation of reciprocity struck with more force than any counter-threat could. It told Trump's team that India wouldn't be strong-armed, but it also gave them a diplomatic off-ramp to reset the terms of engagement on more balanced ground. When Donald Trump came to power, his entire worldview was shaped by the idea that America was being taken advantage of in trade by almost every major partner. India was no exception. In fact, India was singled out more than once in Trump's speeches and tweets, with the recurring complaint that New Delhi had been charging unacceptable tariffs on American goods while enjoying the benefits of American markets. To Trump, this was a simple matter of imbalance that had to be fixed on his terms. His administration stripped India of its Generalized System of Preferences (GSP) status, a trade program that allowed duty-free entry for billions of dollars worth of Indian exports. This was not just an economic move, but a calculated pressure tactic. The message was unmistakable. If India wanted to keep its trade privileges, it had to open up its markets wider to US agricultural products, medical equipment, energy supplies, and other goods that Trump's base cared about. The Trump administration's pressure campaign was built on the assumption that India would have no choice but to concede. After all, the US was one of India's biggest export destinations, and access to the American market had fueled significant parts of India's manufacturing and service sectors. By revoking GSP and layering on threats of more tariffs, Washington thought it was squeezing India into submission. But what Trump underestimated was India's growing confidence on the global stage and its willingness to absorb short-term economic costs to preserve long-term sovereignty. Trade deficits, in Trump's transactional view, were akin to theft. He saw India's surplus in goods trade as evidence of unfair practices. Yet, what this perspective ignored was that India also provided vast business opportunities for American companies, from tech giants to defense manufacturers, and that the relationship was far more interdependent than Trump's numbers suggested. The pressure campaign also revealed Trump's style of diplomacy: loud, transactional, and unapologetically one-sided. For smaller economies, this strategy often worked, but with India, it created friction instead of compliance. By targeting India in the same way he did China, Trump overlooked a fundamental truth. India was not a dependent state, nor was it an economy that could be bullied into lopsided deals. This pressure was precisely what set the stage for Jaishankar's firm invocation of reciprocity, a word that turned Trump's own tactics back against him. Instead of caving, India showed it was prepared to push back, signaling that even America's maximum pressure strategy had limits when applied to a rising power that valued its independence as much as its trade. At the heart of India's response to American pressure under Trump was an unshakable insistence on sovereignty, a refusal to let its policies or priorities be dictated from Washington. For decades, India's foreign policy had been carefully crafted around the principle of strategic autonomy, an inheritance from the non-aligned era that may have evolved but never vanished. What Jaishankar did in that crucial moment was not simply to defend India's trade policies or market regulations, but to reassert a philosophy that cut to the very core of Indian statecraft. Sovereignty meant that India would decide its course not on the basis of foreign coercion, however powerful the source, but on its own calculations of national interest. This wasn't just rhetoric. It was a lived reality visible in India's choices at that time, from maintaining defense ties with Russia to continuing energy purchases from Iran, despite American sanctions pressure. These were not acts of defiance for their own sake. They were deliberate affirmations of independence. Trump's America First policy collided directly with this Indian posture. Washington expected that nations seeking closer ties with the US would adjust their behavior to align with American demands. But New Delhi, under Jaishankar's stewardship, sent the opposite message. Engagement with the United States was welcome, even desirable, but not at the cost of surrendering freedom of action. This was particularly visible in India's handling of defense procurement. While Washington wanted India to reduce its reliance on Russian arms, New Delhi pressed ahead with the S-400 missile system deal, knowing full well it might trigger US sanctions. That decision was more than a purchase. It was a declaration that no foreign power, however influential, would dictate what weapons India could or could not buy. In trade talks, too, sovereignty was written between every line. By refusing to buckle to tariff threats, India communicated that it valued equality over appeasement, signaling that concessions would not come from intimidation, but from mutual respect. This stand of sovereignty resonated far beyond bilateral ties with the United States. It was a global signal that India had matured into a power unwilling to be slotted as a junior partner. The refusal to compromise under pressure revealed not arrogance, but self-assurance. In Jaishankar's worldview, partnerships had to be built on balance, not hierarchy. By making sovereignty the centerpiece of India's diplomacy, New Delhi showcased its determination to remain the author of its destiny. For Trump, who thrived on imposing terms, this approach was frustrating, even shattering, because it exposed the limits of American leverage over a country that had learned to say no without fear. One of the defining features of India's foreign policy under Jaishankar was its ability to maintain a delicate strategic balance at a time when global politics was increasingly polarized. The Trump administration's worldview was shaped by a clear binary. Nations were either with the United States or against it. That approach worked in building pressure campaigns against rivals like China and Iran, but it was far less effective when applied to a country like India, which had no intention of being boxed into someone else's strategic framework. Strategic balance meant India would engage with the United States, deepen defense and economic cooperation, and support joint initiatives like the Quad, but at the same time, it would preserve its independent ties with other powers, even when Washington disapproved. This was evident in the way India handled its relationship with Russia. Despite US objections, India continued defense deals, energy imports, and diplomatic coordination with Moscow, making it clear that its old ally remained essential for its security needs. At the same time, India did not shy away from strengthening defense ties with the United States, buying American helicopters, transport aircraft, and surveillance systems. This was not contradiction, it was careful calibration. Another arena where this balance played out was in energy. While Washington imposed sanctions on Iran and tried to squeeze its oil exports, India sought waivers and continued sourcing energy from Tehran for as long as possible. Iran was not just about oil, it was also about connectivity to Central Asia and the Chabahar port, a project critical for India's strategic access to Afghanistan. By refusing to abandon Iran entirely, India signaled that American sanctions would not automatically become Indian policy. Yet at the same time, India deepened its energy imports from the US, becoming one of the fastest-growing markets for American crude and LNG. This duality underscored New Delhi's ability to turn strategic balancing into opportunity rather than compromise. Even in its handling of China, the balance was visible. India joined hands with the US in highlighting the dangers of Chinese expansionism, yet it kept channels of dialogue with Beijing open, knowing geography dictated engagement. Strategic balance was not about indecision. It was about maximizing autonomy in a multipolar world. For Trump, who demanded clarity and loyalty in absolute terms, this approach was disorienting. But for India, it was the only way to rise as a power that partnered widely while bowing to none. India's foreign policy had often been described in the past as cautious, even hesitant, shaped by the desire to avoid confrontation and keep options open. But under Jaishankar, there was a clear transformation, a sharper edge that turned diplomacy into a demonstration of self-confidence. The word reciprocity became more than a rebuttal to Trump's trade tactics. It became a symbol of this new assertive posture. Assertiveness in diplomacy is not about being reckless or aggressive, but about being unafraid to state national interests openly and defend them without apology. In this case, India refused to bow to the pressure of a global superpower and instead laid down its own terms of engagement. It was an act that captured international attention because it was unexpected. Many nations had adjusted to Trump's America First doctrine by making quiet compromises, offering concessions behind closed doors, or seeking to soften his temper with flattery. India did none of that. By insisting on equality through reciprocity, Jaishankar showcased a bolder India, one that no longer saw itself as a junior partner in the global order. This assertiveness had deep symbolic value. For decades, India had tried to win recognition from the West as a responsible rising power, sometimes by underselling its own strengths to maintain goodwill. But by the time Jaishankar faced Trump's team, India had grown into the world's fifth largest economy, a nuclear-armed state with global ambitions, and a central player in regional stability. Assertive diplomacy was a natural evolution of that reality. When Jaishankar made it clear that India would not tolerate one-sided deals, he wasn't just rejecting an American demand. He was redefining the tone of how India would be treated by all powers. This shift sent ripples across the international system because it announced that India's rise would not be managed or choreographed by others. The symbolism also mattered domestically. For the Indian public, watching their foreign minister stand tall against the most outspoken US president in modern history was a matter of pride. It reflected the idea that India had moved beyond the days of passively navigating world politics and had stepped into an era where it could make demands, not just respond to them. Assertive foreign policy meant showing clarity, not hesitation, and strength, not submission. In that sense, Jaishankar's single word became shorthand for a larger transformation, one in which India's voice in the global arena was no longer polite background noise, but a clear, confident declaration of equality. When Jaishankar invoked reciprocity, the impact did not remain confined to the negotiating table with the United States. The world was watching, and the choice of that single word reverberated across international capitals as a clear signal of how India intended to engage with the global order. At its core, the message was unmistakable. India was done playing the role of a peripheral actor and was prepared to demand parity in its dealings with every major power. For decades, many countries had seen India as a country of immense potential, but one that often lacked the diplomatic confidence to assert itself forcefully. That perception began to shift. The clarity with which India rejected a one-sided arrangement with the United States showed that New Delhi was willing to defend its interests with firmness, even when the stakes involved the world's most powerful nation. This was the global signal that the days of treating India as a secondary partner were over. The timing amplified the effect. The international environment was already unstable, with Washington pushing its America First agenda, Beijing flexing its muscles, and Moscow trying to reclaim lost influence. In this climate, middle powers were being forced to choose sides, but India's response stood out because it showed a third path: strategic independence backed by economic weight and political will. Other nations, especially in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, watched closely. They saw that India could resist pressure and still maintain constructive relations with the US, proving that defiance and diplomacy were not mutually exclusive. This emboldened many to consider their own leverage in global politics instead of accepting great power dominance as inevitable. The global signal also extended to institutions and alliances. By refusing to bend under pressure, India demonstrated that international partnerships had to be mutual, not hierarchical. It projected an image of a power ready to shape, not just join, global conversations. This is why India's assertiveness resonated at forums like the Quad, BRICS, and G20, where countries wanted reassurance that multipolarity was not just rhetoric, but a workable reality. For Trump, the signal was frustrating because it meant Washington could no longer expect easy compliance from a rising power. For the world, it was clarifying because it meant a stronger, more self-assured India was stepping into its role as a shaper of the 21st century order. What truly stands out is not just a clever word, not just a diplomatic phrase, but the sheer symbolism behind it. Reciprocity was more than a rebuttal to Trump's swagger. It was India's announcement that it had stepped fully onto the world stage as a power that demanded respect, not charity. For decades, India had been praised as the land of potential, the future giant, the emerging voice. But in that moment, Jaishankar transformed perception into reality. He told Washington that partnership was welcome, but only on equal footing. He reminded the world that sovereignty was not negotiable, that India would balance its ties without being boxed in, and that no great power, American, Russian, or Chinese, could dictate its choices. The ripple effect was extraordinary. Other nations saw in India a model of dignity under pressure, a nation unafraid to push back against unfairness while still keeping dialogue alive. That is why this episode will be remembered as more than a spat over tariffs. It was a turning point, a message to every capital across the globe. The new India doesn't beg, it doesn't bend, and it certainly doesn't break. It defines its destiny.